Rome is a place that's very different from the other ancient civilizations that we've seen in the Mediterranean world. It's also a place that's very different from the Fertile Crescent civilizations that perhaps one has studied in other ancient history background classes. Unlike Egypt or Greece or Mesopotamia, the other great civilizations of the ancient Mediterranean and Near East, Rome is kind of farther away and later to develop than these great centers. Rome is an Italian state, and Italy, although it sits in the center of the Mediterranean, stood apart from the process of development that brought civilization and brought urban life to the areas of the Fertile Crescent and then eventually to the areas around the Aegean Sea. And there's little urban development of note in Italy before about 1000 BC. And in this, it's very much like Western Europe and not very much like the Eastern Mediterranean. It's an area, like Western Europe, that's distinct and separated from developments to the east. And a lot of this has to do with geography, because the geography of Italy is different from that which you see in places in the Eastern Mediterranean. There's three main features that define the geography of Italy. The first, of course, is the Mediterranean Sea. And Italy, as this map shows, stretches down into the very middle of the Mediterranean Sea, and as is famously acknowledged, it looks like a high-heeled boot kind of kicking Sicily across the center of the Mediterranean. Now, in the Bronze Age, little trade of significance is passing into Italy along the Mediterranean, but its presence in the center of the Mediterranean enables it to be a major part of commercial exchange when the people of Italy are sufficiently economically advanced to do this. And so the Mediterranean made sure that Italy was always concerned with its neighbors, always potentially connected to more developed and more urban civilizations to the east, and is not terribly insular. The second feature is something that both isolates and protects Italy, and this is the Alps. The Alps are to the north of Italy, and they, in a sense, block Italy off against much of the rest of Northern Europe. And this, of course, gives Italy a Mediterranean feel, and it also shifts the way that Italians behave compared to people on the other side of the Alps. So in antiquity, there's a really distinct sense of difference between people living north of the Alps and people living south of the Alps. Southerners ate olives, they cooked with oil taken from plants, they drank wine, and in the view of Romans, they were civilized and refined. Northerners, they drank beer, they cooked with oil and animal fat, and they are seen as much more belligerent and uncivilized. This is the ancient Roman view of what the Alps kind of separated them from. In the Iron Age, the people above the Alps were Celts, and they lived in an area that stretched more or less from the borders of the Ukraine through modern Germany, France, parts of Spain, and Britain. And Italians saw themselves as distinct from Celts. Now, Celts would eventually move down across the Alps, but they wouldn't get deep into the Italian peninsula, at least in a permanent way. Now, the third feature is a feature that divides the geography of Italy itself. And this is a volcanic mountain range called the Apennine Mountains that stretch down kind of the middle of Italy. So if we think of Italy as a boot, this is kind of the leg bone that stretches down the middle of that leg bone. It's a mountain range that basically runs through the middle of Italy itself, and it separates east from west. But unlike the Alps, these mountains top out at around 5,000 feet. So they're tall, but they're not impassable. And on either side of these mountains is a large, relatively flat coastal plain that has extremely fertile soil because the Apennines and some of the other areas around that coastal plain are volcanoes. And so this volcanic activity produces a very rich soil, and much of these plains have a kind of rich volcanic soil. And if we want to imagine, keep one in mind, of course, the area around Mount Vesuvius, what's now kind of Naples, but what was once also Pompeii and Herculaneum, this gives you a very real sense of the danger, but also the tremendous fertility in those regions. Now, eventually, Romans also figure out how to make use of a kind of volcanic rock form called tufa. It's a strong rock, but it's an easily cut rock. And so Romans will eventually figure out how to use tufa to build with, a much better building material and a much easier to work with material than, say, marble or some of the stones that we see in the East. But also Romans figure out how to use volcanic ash from places in the Apennines to create concrete. And this enables Italian peoples to build large, sturdy structures from native materials. Now, the part of Italy in which Rome develops is particularly well placed for the kind of development that Rome is undergoing. And this is an area that's called Latium. You can see that in the middle of your map. And Latium is on the west coast of the peninsula, and it's an area that's bisected by the Tiber River. And the Tiber is one of the few rivers that can be sailed in Italy, and one of the very few that can be sailed in southern Italy, or in central Italy. And Rome itself is located on one of the best sites in Latium. When you go to Rome, you obviously can see some of these advantages. So what you see in this picture is the Tiber Island. This is an island that sits in the middle of the Tiber. You can see on the right of the slide, you see a bridge, and then on the other side of the island, you see another bridge. This is because the Tiber Island bisects the Tiber. It represents then a natural crossing point for people to go across the Tiber, but in the earliest period of Roman history, the Tiber Island and that bisection of the Tiber River represented a place beyond which ocean-going or Mediterranean sea-going ships could not travel. And so the Tiber represented a kind of natural commercial stopping point for commercial vessels that entered into the Tiber River, and a place where they would offload their cargo. It's also a place where people moving from the north to the south would work along land routes that also passed along this point in the Tiber River. And so what this meant is that Rome occupied a crossing point that benefited directly from both land-based and sea-based trade. And in the early years of the city's life, Rome was accessible to smaller merchant vessels. This, of course, changed later as ships got bigger. But these merchant vessels could sail up from the mouth of the Tiber to trade, but warships were too big to do this. There were sandbars at the mouth of the Tiber that prevented larger warships from going up and attacking Rome. And so on some level, what we see is that Rome had, in these very early moments, the advantages of a maritime port, but without the military exposure to this. And as time goes on, and the commercial transactions move a little bit further south, what we see is Rome has the ability to engage in commercial activities, but not be affected by some of the things that happen when ships do have easy access to a city. The other thing is that Rome had a great position from which to defend itself against land attacks, because Rome was perched on 7 hills. And in between the hills is a marshy area that is long since drained. That's called the Forum Boarium. And so this is an image of the Forum Boarium taken from basically kind of the edge of the Palatine Hill. And what you see are, you see an arch in the foreground, then you see a round temple, and then you see a square Roman temple. These are all ancient constructions. And this is the area that was in the very earliest period of the city of Rome. This was a cattle market. This is why it's called the Forum Boarium. Forum is literally a place where commercial transactions occur, and Boarium means cattle. And so the Forum Boarium is another one of these commercial places that people could access because of the city of Rome. But the people living in the city of Rome actually lived on hills above these places where people gathered, and so they were protected. They had high ground and the ability to defend themselves if someone were to attack them. And so basically, the point is that Rome grows up in a very advantageous location for both commercial transactions and also for defensive activities. Now, the prehistory of the site involves, of course, this larger story of Italy and the development of Italy. And so Italy, as we've already talked about, enters into this kind of world of ancient Mediterranean urban civilizations relatively late. Humans had lived in Italy since 700,000 BC, apparently. And trade between Italy and other areas can be traced to the 3rd millennium BC. But basically, that trade consisted of more developed economies coming and trading with Italians and getting more or less raw materials and trading more polished goods to those Italians. The first real signs of organized, settled life appear in northern Italy around 1700 BC, and they consist basically of wood huts arranged in villages along the Po River. Between 1300 and 1100 BC, Indo-European settlers begin to move into Italy, and when these people arrive, they brought with them a burial practice that becomes one of the first really clear signs of the cultural life in Italy in the immediate predecessor, or the immediate moments preceding the development of the city of Rome. By about 1000, this burial culture becomes something that's distinctive enough that it is called by archaeologists Villanovan archaeological culture. Now, the idea of an archaeological culture refers simply to the archaeological remains of a place that exhibit a similar set of characteristics. And when the remains from a number of sites are physically similar, you can say that these places had at least some aspects of cultural similarity or cultural communication. Now, usually the archaeological culture is named after the first site where the objects that show these characteristics are found. And so in this case, the remains are called Villanovan because the town of Villanova is that sort of first place or largest, most significant place where the culture was identified. And the urns that are typical of this culture are really first found there. But Villanova itself is not the most important city or place in which this culture existed. It's actually on the geographical fringe of this area, but it still gets priority simply because it's the place that came to our attention first. Now, the urns themselves contain the remains of the dead, and they've been found at many sites across northern and central Italy. And they also contain objects that belonged to the dead, things like tools, weapons, brooches, or razors. And so when you see these objects buried in similar vessels in many different locations, you can say that you have evidence for a common archaeological culture. Now, the archaeological culture in early Rome is a subset of Villanovan culture that's called the cultura laziale. And it's seen as not totally disconnected from the Villanovan archaeological culture, but it is somewhat different. It's a basically related local culture known in the area around the city of Rome. And so here you see some examples of burials that come from the cultura laziale, graves. Now, cultura laziale is typified by something a little bit different. Instead of using those elaborate kind of conical Villanovan funeral urns, the cultura laziale burials involved a sort of pot. And you can see on the left what this pot looks like. And then within the pot are a grouping of similar objects. So you see some of these little things, but the most important thing that's in there is this vessel where the actual bones and remains of the person is placed. And you can see that that vessel is shaped like a hut. And so clearly what you have there is a representation of the space in which this person lived. And their remains, which are always cremated, are included in this space to represent, again, in the afterlife or in death, the sort of placement of them in the environment that's similar to where they live. Now, one other feature that's particularly notable is that the bodies in these cultura laziale style burials have been previously cremated. And so these basically consist of the ashes and the bones of somebody. Now, the other thing that we see is that as time passes, the cremation burials typical of the cultura laziale, they become more rare. And the objects contained in tombs and tombs themselves, tombs become bigger and the objects contained in them become more elaborate. And as time passes, cremation burial is increasingly replaced by inhumations. And this seems to suggest that the cremation burial was a rite that was once reserved for important members of the community. But as the community grew, it seems that fewer people were taking advantage or using this. Now, the cultura laziale seems to persist from 1000 until a little bit after the year 800 BC. And this is important because some of the first inhabitants, some of the first indications of habitation on the site of what will eventually become Rome are tombs that show signs of cultura laziale style burials. And so what this suggests is that Rome is slowly developing. And it's slowly developing in this context and in this place where we see this common culture, but also a local and distinctive element of this common culture. And that's important because When we think of Italy in antiquity, we have to understand the incredible diversity of this place, and especially the incredible diversity of central Italy. What you see in Cultura Laziale is a distinctive local manifestation of an archaeological culture that exists much more widely. But this is mirrored also in linguistic differences and other cultural differences that mark people in Latium as participants in a larger Italian world, but also distinctive from many others in that world. And this is important because I think a lot of people, when they consider Italy now, they think of it as a relatively uniform place where there's a sort of common Italian dialect, there's a common, a religion that many Italians share. And this is illusionary even now, of course. But in antiquity, the situation was not a place of unity. It was actually a place where there's a tremendous diversity in the Italian peninsula, linguistically, culturally, in every kind of aspect of diversity. We can imagine that it's probably present in this context. And so, as you can see from this map of Italian linguistic regions in antiquity, there are a lot of them. And at the very center of the map, you see LAT. That's Latin. And so Latin will become the language that dominates not only Italy, but all of the Western Mediterranean, and it will hold that title for centuries, millennia almost. But when Latin starts as a language, it starts in this very small place. It's one of the smaller linguistic groups in this incredibly diverse linguistic environment. The big regions are Etruria to the north, where you see Etruscan spoken. And if you look along the coasts from southern Italy all the way down into Sicily, you see Greek. And each of these are interesting in their own light. Now, Greek is a relatively new introduction to Italy at the time we're talking about. If we're looking at the 8th century BC, Greeks are only beginning to come there. But the Greek cities and the place you see Greek, these are places that are settled by Greek colonists coming from the Greek mainland during the great age of Greek colonization. And so these cities run from eastern Sicily all the way up the coast, almost to the border of Latium, areas in Campania, and the city of Naples. This is actually a evolution of the Greek word for that place, which was Neapolis, the new city. And so Greek represents a really significant geographical extent of the coasts of southern and central Italy, as well as eastern Sicily. And Greeks are, of course, probably familiar. But the reason that Greek colonization is largely confined to the coasts is because in the mountainous areas in Sicily and in Italy, they do not have the capacity to really expand easily into those areas. Oscans are very difficult people to fight, and we will certainly see that when we get later into the discussion of Roman expansion. And the same is true in Sicily, where Greek colonization runs up against both native populations and then also Phoenician colonization from Carthage that starts in the west. The Etruscans are probably less well known to many people. Now, whereas Greek is one of the greatest civilizations of antiquity and one of the most documented in terms of the literature that survives and the development of literary culture there, we are not so fortunate with Etruscan. And part of this is because Etruscan is a language that is not directly related to any other language that we know. We know that Etruscan is not an Indo-European language like Greek or Latin or English or German. But the other thing that's important is the rise of Rome in the 4th century as it rose to dominance over Etruscan areas eventually eliminates spoken Etruscan because these Etruscan areas get so completely integrated into the Roman state that basically people start speaking Latin. And so by the 1st century BC, it seems that no one is an active living speaker of Etruscan. People knew it. Scholars, priests, and others still knew Etruscan. But by the end of the 1st century AD, it's clear that even that knowledge is starting to pass away. And so the problem that we have is that Etruscan culture, and especially Etruscan literature, gets completely supplanted by Latin language literature because of the Roman domination of this area. And so it's a very rare civilization that thrives and is a literate civilization and a literary civilization, but it disappears completely because it is completely overwhelmed by a more powerful expansionary neighbor to the south. So what we do have for Etruscan language and what we can do with Etruscan sort of storytelling and literature is look at things like tombstones and paintings and get a sense to a degree of what was done there. But the extent of our ability to interact with Etruscan is largely confined to these small texts, tiny inscriptions or in other things written on paintings and other objects. And so it isn't enough for us to really recapture what the language is doing or how the literary culture worked. The other thing that we do understand about Etruscans, though, is they live in city-states that are religiously and perhaps culturally linked to each other, but politically separate from each other. And so this religious and cultural linkage is something that's called the Etruscan League. There was even an idea at one point, when you go back to, say, the 18th century, early 19th century, that there was actually a unified Etruscan empire, and at a certain point, this Etruscan empire took over Rome. And this isn't really accepted any longer. But it is clear that the Etruscan League existed in some form and provided a kind of cultural connection that joined a lot of these Etruscan cities. But it was not a political entity. It was not a military alliance. It was instead a much more looser collection of cities that shared similar religious beliefs, a similar religious calendar, and also had some similar cultural aspects. The other thing we can say about the Etruscans, though, is that they are very wealthy. Surprisingly, much of the intact Greek pottery that we possess has been preserved because it was in Etruria, not in Greece. And so this, for example, is the Euphronius crater, and this is a very famous object because it was looted from an Etruscan grave in the 1970s, and for a while was in the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York, and there was a very significant court fight eventually to get this repatriated back to Italy. This is the kind of thing that appears in Etruscan graves. And this is actually one of the few objects by a very famous Greek painter that survives to this day. And it survives not from Greece, but from Etruria. But this vase also, or this crater also shows us something that's very significant about the Etruscans. Not only does it show that they have great artistic taste, but it shows that they are trading with Greeks, and to a degree, it seems that Greek manufacturers even create objects for an Etruscan market. But Etruscans are not just consuming Greek artistic products. They have a very robust artistic culture of their own. So one of the ways that we can access this is by going and visiting places where Etruscan burials took place. So this is a set of Etruscan tombs from Cerveteri in Italy, and you can see that there's a very distinctive style to this. They're kind of like mound tombs or tumulus tombs. You go into them and there's a chamber on the inside, and inside the chamber, this is one of the more spectacular examples, you see that these are decorated, they're painted, and sometimes even you have these really elaborate caskets. This is an Etruscan casket. It's now in the Villa Giulia in the city of Rome, in the Etruscan National Museum. And what you see about this is Etruscan work, and Etruscan artwork in particular, is done in terracotta, a kind of baked clay. And this material is very common in Etruscan art. But other things done in Etruscan art also show workings with bronze and other materials as well. Now, there's also a distinctive Etruscan architectural style. And so this is an Etruscan temple. The reconstruction exists and is presently something you can visit in the Villa Giulia, the Etruscan Museum in Rome. And you can see that an Etruscan temple is similar to a Greek temple, but actually in many ways it's somewhat different. So obviously you have there a column, colonnaded entrance. And so the large overhanging roof in an Etruscan temple, though, is not something that you see in a Greek design. What you see with Greek temples is the columns go all the way around the temple. And so on the right of the slide, you see the Temple of Aphia in the island of Aegina. This is a very good, well-preserved Greek-style temple. And you can see that the columns go all the way around a sort of central area within the building. In an Etruscan temple, there's a colonnade on the pediment, on this overhanging area, but the back of the temple is solid. It's not something that has columns. It's instead basically just like a building. And so what you can see is the very strong Greek influence, but also the distinctive Etruscan approach to it. And both the temple design and the Etruscan artwork serve as a model for later Roman designs. So when we will look at the Temple of Jupiter in the city of Rome, what we'll see is that the Capitoline Temple of Jupiter is modeled on Etruscan designs. It is not a Greek temple. It's a Roman temple that uses Etruscan styles and probably even Etruscan architects and builders. The great mystery, though, about the Etruscans concerns their place of origin. And this is a mystery that goes all the way back to antiquity, because even in antiquity, people didn't really know where the Etruscans came from. And so there's even many stories about this in antiquity that are preserved by Greek historians. So the historian Herodotus said that Etruscans migrated to Italy from Lydia, a region in southeastern Turkey. The Greek historian Thucydides says that they came from the island of Lemnos. And actually, oddly, in support of this, there's an inscription with Etruscan writing that was found on Lemnos. Now, this can seem like it's really compelling, really wonderful evidence that Etruscans must have come from Lemnos. But in reality, this proves very little. It's like the cache of Roman coins that were found in Japan relatively recently. Those coins may suggest, those 4th century coins, they may suggest that the Romans were in Japan, maybe even conquered Japan in the 4th century BC. But of course we know that that's ridiculous, that the Romans never got to Japan, never even really knew about Japan. What's more likely is that somebody at a later date brought those coins to Japan and somebody in Japan was interested in them. So the fact that you have an Etruscan inscription in Lemnos might actually just mean that at a later date, somebody knew what Thucydides had said and came and put something up in Lemnos to commemorate their connection to the homeland. We don't really know, but it's far from the smoking gun evidence that it might seem all at first. Modern scholars have their own views about this. So some scholars have held that Etruscans were simply always in Italy. Now, it's not clear what exactly that would mean and how one would always be in Italy. And this seems to be something of a cop-out, because obviously they came from somewhere. But we don't really have good evidence for anywhere else. And so some of the other stories we get are a little more fanciful. In the 19th century, Theodor Mommsen, the great German historian, suggested that Etruscans came from the north and settled gradually. That seems potentially plausible. But from archaeological evidence, it doesn't look like it's true. Instead, it looks like the settlements that have Etruscans in them move in from the coasts, not from the north to the south, but basically from the coastal areas to the interior of the peninsula. And so this suggests that there's a possibility that they migrated, but it also suggests that it was more likely that if they migrated, they did so either on ships or by walking down a coastal plain. Etruscans, though, don't really begin to thrive and show up in really prominent ways until the 9th or 8th century BC. And by then, it's clear they've been in Italy for a long time. So Etruscans took part in Villanovan archaeological culture, and much of what develops in their culture grew out of the cultural environment that we see reflected in the Villanovan culture. But at the same time, their alphabet, their written language, appears in the 8th century BC, and it's based upon the Greek alphabet. But they adopted this very quickly. They adopted this, not that long after the Greeks adopted the alphabet themselves. So in the end, I think what we can see is that the Etruscans came to Italy from somewhere. We don't know where, but this happened a long time before their civilization reached its peak. But when their civilization reached its peak, they were a very adaptive group of people, willing and able to communicate commercially, economically, and culturally with not only the people around them, but also people from across the Adriatic Sea. And they were very, very willing to adapt the best practices and adapt ideas and artistic practices from the people around them and the people with whom they traded. And so Etruscans are probably not native Italians, but their culture as it developed represents this remarkable kind of fusion of Italian and non-Italian that kind of represents the best of both aspects of the Mediterranean world, both East and West, but also represents a ability to fuse those good aspects and create something that is distinctively Italian. Now, another important people that we encounter when we're talking about the area where Rome developed are people called the Sabines. And these are people who spoke an Oscan dialect. They're a group of people that are on the northern part of the Oscan range. And they're basically the mountain people to the east of the city of Rome. And Roman relationships with them are very close. There's even a suggestion that some of the kings of the early kings of Rome were Sabines. But the best evidence for the close relationship between Romans and Sabines is the famous story of the Sabine women, which we'll talk about shortly. But at this point, it's simply important to just say that the Romans thought they had long-standing relationships with the Sabines, and they figure greatly in the representation that Rome has in its early history with its interaction with other people. But Romans themselves belong to a small group of people called the Latins, and they will quickly become the dominant state in the Latin cultural and political environment, but they're actually kind of on the frontier of the Latin area. So if we look at the map of Italian linguistic regions, we see Latium is a very small area. You see the Sabines to the north, you see the Etruscans kind of to the northwest, and then you see LAT, the Latin areas. Now, Rome quickly becomes the most important Latin state and the head of the Latin League, but this is going to be most significant in the future because we first need to consider the question of how Rome itself developed. So historians who work on this period see Rome following something called an agglomerative model of development. And this is the notion that a city grew by slowly incorporating a number of different geographically close villages. And as they came together, these villages gradually merged so that they formed one city. So a way to think about this perhaps is by considering, say, some of the major metropolitan areas that we see in the United States. So to give an example from my home area, from San Diego, 50 or 60 years ago, if you were to go to the San Diego area, you would see that there are distinct cities along the coast. There's the city of Oceanside, and then there's a gap, and then there's the city of Carlsbad, and then there's farmland, and then there's the city of Encinitas, and then there's more farmland, and then there's the city of Solana Beach, and then that's separated from the city of Del Mar, which is separated from the city of La Jolla, and so on. And then as you move down to the city of San Diego, and you get to the south, you see there are other cities that, again, are separate from each other. Now, though, if you cross the Mexican border and you start driving north on Interstate 5, you don't see any of these differences. These places are marked only simply as road signs indicating that you're in a new town. But you wouldn't notice this or recognize these differences because the cities have grown so much that they've kind of grown into each other. This is an agglomerative model of development, where places that were once distinct settlements grow and expand until they overlap with each other. And so those cities grow and merge, not because one conquers the other, they just sort of blend into each other. And this is a kind of logical way to think about things. As villages grow, they come to touch each other, their boundaries become more flexible, become more fluid, and eventually they join together in a kind of political way. Now, archaeological evidence suggests that cultura laziali burials in Rome indicate that Rome probably developed in a similar way, because remains have been found on a number of the hills that will eventually make up the city of Rome. But as you can see from this image of what the 7 hills of Rome look like, they're distinct from each other. And so it is natural to imagine that a settlement that develops on the Capitoline or on the Caelian Hill will be different from a settlement that develops on the Palatine. And the earliest evidence that we have for really sort of settlements there is a set of post holes dug in the bedrock on top of the Palatine. And this has been called the so-called House of Romulus. And it was found actually in the 1930s during excavations, but this does suggest that what we have is a very early settlement on the site of the Palatine Hill. Now, it may be natural to assume, as our Roman historians do, that the settlement that starts on the Palatine expands out and conquers the neighboring hills and eventually becomes the city made up of the 7 hills of the city of Rome, because the people on the Palatine eventually do an expansion that allows them to militarily incorporate these other places. But this actually doesn't make a whole lot of sense, because the remains we see suggest that there are settlements on these other hills, but also we see traces of a time when the hills were independent from each other. And the way that this is framed in our literature suggests that actually the agglomerative model development is what is going on. So in the 1st century AD, the historian Pliny describes a religious ritual in which groups from Italian cities went to a sacred site. And then he gives a list of the cities that were involved. So he says the first region formerly included the following celebrated towns of Latium, besides those mentioned: Citricum, Pamentia, Scapatia, Politorium, Telena, Tafada, Canina, Ficana, Crustumerium, Amariola, Medulum, Corniculum, Saturnia on the site of the present Rome, Antipolis, which today is the Janiculum and a part of Rome, Antemnae, Camarium, Colacia, Amitinum, Norbe, Sulmno, and together with these, the Alban peoples who were accustomed to receive flesh on the Alban hills, and then he gives a list of Alban cities. Thus, 53 people of old Latium have perished without leaving a trace. Now, what's interesting about this is that the city of Rome is not there at all. What you have is the city of Saturnia, which is on the site of the present city of Rome, the city of Antipolis, which today is the Janiculum and a part of Rome. And so what you have there are pieces of the city of Rome that were once distinct from each other, so distinct, in fact, that they participated separately in a set of religious activities that involved all of the different towns of Latium. But eventually, by the time Pliny is writing, they aren't separate. They have come together and they aren't distinctive. In fact, they are components of the city of Rome itself. And so Rome is not mentioned on this list, but two of its hills are mentioned. And so what this suggests is that the agglomerative model of development, where settlements across the hills of the city of Rome grow into each other, actually makes some sense. And the growth of the city of Rome consisted initially of communities on those hills expanding down into the valleys below those hills and blending with each other and creating a polity that ultimately unifies all of those different spaces. And so these are the pieces of evidence that we have for the earliest foundation and growth of the city of Rome. But Romans had their own traditions about their foundation. And there's actually kind of two sorts of traditions. One of them seems to be quite old, and another comes later and reflects Roman contacts with the Greek world. Now, the earlier tradition seems to be a native Italian tradition, and this is the famous story of Romulus and Remus. The story goes that the king of Alba Longa is overthrown by his evil brother, and Rhea Silvia, the daughter of the king, is forced to become a Vestal virgin. And this is a woman who dedicates her virginity to the goddess Vesta. And while she's a Vesta, she's impregnated by the god Mars and has twins. And of course, this is a virgin birth, right? But because the twins are seen as illegitimate, the king orders them placed in a basket and floated down the Tiber River, which is an interesting thing because the Tiber is actually quite a distance from Alba Longa. But the river then recedes and the babies are found by a she-wolf. And they're suckled by the she-wolf until they're found then by a shepherd, and they're raised by the shepherd. And then over time, they discover who they actually are, and they come back to depose the evil king. Then the twins lead a colony to found the city of Rome. After founding the city, they quarrel. Romulus kills Remus, and eventually Romulus serves as the first king of Rome. And there's a bunch of obvious folktale elements here. Obviously, the baby in the basket evokes Moses. And again, I'm not saying that the Romans knew the story of Moses, but I'm just saying that this is a common folktale element. Cain and Abel, the brothers who fight, again, a folktale element. The suckling by a she-wolf is also said to have been the case of the development of Cyrus the Great in Persia. These are folktale elements that kind of exist in the ether. Romans are not borrowing directly from traditions about Cyrus. They're not borrowing directly from the Bible, but these things sort of float around, and the Romans are picking these up and putting them together in a tradition that describes the development of their city through the birth of Romulus and Remus. But there's a second part of the story, and this is a much more interesting part. After leading the colony to Rome, Romulus realizes that he doesn't have enough people for the city to work. And so he rounds up a group of criminals to populate the city, criminals and exiles and other people who don't have anywhere else to be. And of course, in the story, these criminals and exiles are overwhelmingly men, and this is a problem. They don't have enough women. And so to get women, the story goes, Romulus tells the neighboring Sabine community that they're having an open house and the Sabines should come to have view of the new city. There'll be a big festival and the Sabines will be treated very nicely. But when the Sabines show up, the Romans kidnap the Sabine women and then fight a war to keep the Sabine women. And the story ends that at the end of the war, Romulus and the Sabine king rule together over the city of Rome. Now, it's been suggested by some people that this story reflects a kind of anti-Roman propaganda that the city develops from criminals and kidnappers, and this isn't really a positive reflection on Rome. But there's reasons to believe that this is not true. I mean, the image of Lupa, the image of the wolf, is something that is relatively common in Roman artistic traditions. But also, the story of Romulus and Remus is a story that is not just about corruption and kidnapping and criminality. The story of Romulus and Remus is also a story about inclusion. Because the story of the criminals and the Sabine women being taken into the community and given full membership in the community when they are taken in, and the partnership with the Sabine king, these are all elements that suggest something that makes Rome very unique. Rome in antiquity was one of the very few places that had a kind of open citizenship policy. In the earliest years of the Roman monarchy, what Rome was willing to do was give citizenship to people who had talents or resources that could make the society better. And so Rome was unlike, say, Athens or Sparta or some of these other city-states that you see in the Mediterranean, where the citizen ranks were very closed. In Rome, the citizen population was open. It was something where people could take part, where people could participate. And if Romans conquered an area, Romans were willing to extend citizenship to people in that area as well. This is a traditional Roman value. And the story of the Sabine women, the story of the incorporation of the criminals, the story of Romulus creating a city around these ideas reflects very deeply a Roman sense of who they are. And so this is an internal story. It's one that, of course, doesn't work very well for modern sensibilities, but it is one that reflects the deep sensibilities that Romans had, that their society was a relatively open one. One that was willing to accept new people into it if they had the appropriate talents or if they had something to offer to the Roman state. The external story that seems to have come later resulted probably from Greek and Roman communication, and this centers on the figure of Aeneas. So Aeneas is a minor Trojan hero who, it was said, was saved in the Trojan War so that he could succeed Priam, the king of Troy, and found a new city. And so the story goes that Aeneas founded a city of Trojans somewhere else. And the Roman version of this is he founded it in Italy. And so Rome ultimately becomes the new city of these Trojans. But Aeneas doesn't found Rome, because of course this story is coming after Romans have decided that Romulus and Remus founded Rome. And so the story of Aeneas is one where Aeneas leaves Troy, he sails to Italy, he settles in Italy, and he drowns. But his son then founds the city of Alba Longa, and Romulus and Remus are descended from the line of Aeneas that founded the city of Alba Longa. Now this story is modeled to some degree about stories about Greek colonial foundations. The idea of a person leaving home and settling abroad is really consistent with Greek notions of how colonies work. And it also helps Greeks explain things. It explains how Rome, in this sort of backwards, far western part of the Mediterranean, eventually becomes a force that conflicts with Greeks and dominates Greeks. Because Rome is able to do this because Rome is, in a sense, Trojan. And the conflict between Greeks and Romans or the conflict between Greeks and Trojans becomes the conflict between Greeks and Romans. But this gives Greeks a way to integrate Romans into a narrative of the Mediterranean that includes much deeper connections to peoples like the Trojans. Now, Romans not only felt that these stories about their origins were factual, they felt that they were so well documented that they could even go back and date the foundation of their city. So in the 1st century BC, a man named Varro counted back to determine the time when he believed that Rome was founded. And he arrived at the date of 753 BC, and this became the year 1 for Romans. So 753 BC equals 1 AUC, or ab urbe condita, from the date of the foundation of the city. And in some cases, when you read really old Roman historians, you will see that they still date things by AUC dating. I don't. Most people don't now, but some people in the past did. Uh, the idea behind AUC dating is this notion that a specific event occurred and that marked the beginning of the community. And so there's a ceremonial moment before which one can say there is no Rome, and after which one can say, yes, now there is Rome. And you can also say who the founder was, and he's the person responsible for creating that moment. And so this is a very comforting way to see things, right? There is a time before which there was no Rome. But it doesn't suit our historical evidence. Obviously, the image that we have of the creation of Rome is not there was a moment and this place was created. It is instead a gradual process of people settling on those hills, maybe people occupying them for a time before they settled them, people building huts and then ultimately building settlements on top of those hills that grew into one another and created the community that we will know as the city of Rome. It wasn't one guy on one day sitting down and saying, now we're making the city. But the idea of one guy on one day sitting down and making the city was reassuring to Romans, and it allows Romans to build out the story of their monarchy and their early history that we'll turn to in the next lecture.